importance of thinking about habitat and biodiversity management from the outset. We've had a number of clients who've come to us with issues and also sort of facing enforcement action from the environmental regulators because things have gone wrong on site. So whether that's the plans haven't been in place, they've not considered biodiversity issues thoroughly enough. Can you give us some sort of practical things that they should be thinking about to make sure that issues don't arise?
Yeah, so there's a number of practical things that you can do to try and avoid unwanted issues down the line. I think the first one is just making sure that you've got a clear plan and clear instructions to everyone involved in the site, employees, everyone working on that site, especially if you're dealing with protected species, because that increases your risk of something going wrong. So just make sure that you've got a really clear plan in place and ideally written down as well, so people can refer back to that. Also ensuring that effective supervision is in place, whether or not this is someone within the company or if you decide this needs to be an ecologist, then make sure you really take the time in making sure that there is someone appropriate to supervise in place. If you are dealing with protected species, then you are likely to need an ecologist to supervise if you don't have that expertise in-house. Also making sure that that you're regularly going back to your strategy. You might see a site and you might think that there's no issues, and as you start works on site you find protected species, for example, things are always changing and evolving. So I think it's important to recognise that while we want to be as prepared as we can to prevent stoppages, it's not something we can always do. So I think make sure that your strategy is adaptable and anticipates the need to change and develop as well. Also ensuring that you've got the correct permits, licenses, permissions in place to start works and also continue them to prevent stoppages, and also make sure that, as I kind of touched on before, once the development's over, you don't forget about those licenses and potentially post-development works or monitoring that you might need to undertake, because that's potentially where you could get caught out later on. You might have thought you've done everything right, but potentially missed post-development works. So it's really important to make sure that you've got these licenses and permits in place and that you read them to make sure that you understand what you need to do. You might also need to do some license returns, which will be due. So it's just really important to make sure that you read and understand everything that you've got to make sure that you are complying even post-development. You might look to include habitat enhancements from the offset. It might be something you want to do for various reasons. It might help as well with the general greenery, so something to consider. Also, you might consider it appropriate to conduct fencing to help if there's an area that needs to kind of be cornered off. But it's really important that if you're doing that for species, that you've got an advice from an ecologist to make sure you're not actually doing any damage by erecting that fencing. You might kind of do it with all good intentions and then end up committing an offence. So it's really important that if you are doing something to try and manage the risks like that, that you've just got the right advice and that you're following it.
And obviously with all these measures, is it something that you might recommend to have training for your operators on site, any contractors that come on site, a kind of formal training regime for habitats and biodiversity management?
Yes, absolutely. And this should be kind of shaped on the back of your plan and what issues you're dealing with. You might find that if you've got a protected species licence that requires your ecologist to give a toolbox talk. That's very common, that usually it will require that. But even if that's not necessarily required by a licence or other permit, it's still important to give training and make sure everyone's aware if you do have certain areas fenced off as to why they're fenced off, just to avoid any issues down the line, especially if you've got lots of different people coming onto site that aren't necessarily going to be aware that there is this plan in place. So
we know the importance of considering habitat and biodiversity management. Who would you say is responsible for ensuring a business is compliant in this regard, or does it depend on the type of business, for example?
Yeah, so I think each business will have its own key stakeholders that are responsible for ensuring that there's a habitat management plan in place. But it's important to recognise at each stage who should accept responsibility, because it won't necessarily be one person throughout the process. While they might have overall responsibility, that's not necessarily going to be practical, and you're going to need other people to take responsibility for different stages. It might be that you have one individual, or you decide that a team of individuals is more appropriate, and it will really depend on what risks you're facing on site and what issues there are. You might even have external third parties who are responsible, such as ecologists. You might also seek to get some legal advice. So people will be responsible for kind of different stages of the overall plan. It's also important to make sure that that person is involved throughout the process. So if they leave, they might need to be replaced. As I kind of touched on before, it's not necessarily just the planning stages that someone will need to be involved. If you've got an ecologist on board, you might need them involved for the post-development stages as well. If people in the business leave, it could easily slip under the net. Someone might not be giving your ecologist the instructions they need to carry out potentially licence conditions, and you could find yourself inadvertently in breach of a licence. So it's really important that whoever you decide is responsible for each stage is replaced in the event that they leave the business as well, just to avoid any unwanted breaches. So as kind of an example, at the initial evaluation and planning stage, you might have a kind of project lead or someone designated within the business that takes this on for each project. And then after that stage, you might look to engage third parties, as mentioned before. So they'll assume different relationships for the work they're doing and different responsibilities. And then when it comes down to the construction stage, that's going to be site managers that are ultimately responsible for making sure that areas aren't disrupted if they don't need to be. Perhaps the ecologist is on site with you as well. And also there should be supervisors in place to make sure that everyone's supervised. But ultimately it will be everyone's responsibility to make sure that everything's being followed as it shouldn't. And if there are any fenced off areas, these aren't being accessed when they shouldn't.
We've talked about planning these things and making sure that everybody is aware of what's going on site. I think I also mentioned, sometimes even with the best laid plans, things do go wrong. What are the consequences if businesses don't get this right?
This is best shown through a couple of examples of prosecutions. So in 2016, a UK property developer was fined over 10 grand for destroying a bat roost. In 2018, a company moved waste onto land that was a habitat for great crested newts, and they were fined £50,000, and this penalty is unlimited, so it could have potentially been a lot worse. A housing developer, together with a tree contractor, was fined a total of £420,000 after being found guilty in 2019 for breaching a tree preservation. So important to make sure that you're preventing fines as much as you can. I would ensure that you seek appropriate assistance and counsels as soon as you think something might have gone wrong, even if the regulators aren't involved at that stage, because they can provide you with advice on what to do to hopefully minimise your exposure. It is a complicated area and the offences aren't always black and white, so try and obtain that specialist advice as soon as you can. And it's not always doom and gloom when things go wrong. Hopefully your legal advisors and counsels can help you find a resolution which will work for you and also the regulator and also the potentially habitable species affected.